The Book of Genesis, an overview. Let us start at the very beginning. The Book of Genesis is the first chapter of the Bible's grand story. It opens with God creating a good and beautiful world, full of order, light, and life. Humanity is made in God's own image, called to reflect His character, care for the earth, and live in blessing. But it does not take long for things to fall apart. Humans choose pride over trust, rebellion over obedience. From the Garden of Eden to the Tower of Babel, we see a downward spiral of violence, division, and brokenness. Still, God does not give up. In a surprising twist, He launches a rescue plan, not through armies or empires, but through one ordinary man named Abraham. God promises that through Abraham's family, blessing will come to every nation on earth. Genesis tells a story of creation and collapse, of sin and second chances. But most of all, it shows us a faithful God who keeps reaching out, even when humanity keeps walking away. This is where the whole biblical story begins. Part 1. Creation and humanity's fall. Genesis chapters 1 to 11. 1. Creation and human commission. The book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into two main parts. There are chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. Then there are chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. These two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. This design gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. The book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order, beauty, and goodness. He creates a world where life can flourish. God creates these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He creates them in His image. This has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So, the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they are appointed as God's representatives to rule His world on His behalf. In this context, it means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and to make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. This is a key word in this book. And He gives them a garden, which is like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. 2. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil and human choice. The key is that the humans have a choice about how they are going to go about building this world. And that is represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up until now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now, God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil? Or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? The stakes are very high. To rebel against God means to embrace death, because you are turning away from the giver of life Himself. This is represented by the tree of life. 3. The serpent's temptation and humanity's fall. In chapter 3, a mysterious creature, a snake, enters into the story. The snake is given no introduction, other than it is a creature that God made. It quickly becomes clear that it is a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It claims that seizing the knowledge of good and evil will not bring death, but that it is actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. The irony of this is tragic, because we know humans. They are already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy. They take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. 4. Consequences of the fall. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. They cannot even trust each other. so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God. When God finds them, they begin this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. 5. God's promise and humanity's ongoing decline. Right here, the story stops, and there is a series of short poems where God declares to the snake, and then to the humans, the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed or a descendant will come from the woman who is going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head, which sounds like great news. But this victory is going to come with a cost, because the snake also will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it is being crushed. It is a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor, but in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they have just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them, but this does not erase the consequences of the humans' decision. So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, is going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. 6. The spread of sin. From here, the story then spirals downward. Chapters 3 through 11 trace the widening ripple effect of rebellion and of human relationships fracturing at every level. So there is a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain is so jealous of his brother that he wants to murder him. God warns him not to give in to the temptation, but he does anyway. He murders him in the field. Cain then goes on to build a city where violence and oppression reign. This is all epitomized in the story of Lamech. He is the first man in the Bible to have more than one wife. He is accumulating them like property. Then he goes on to sing a short song about how he is more violent and vengeful than Cain ever was. 7. The Flood and the Tower of Babel. After this, we get an odd story about the sons of God, which could refer to evil angelic beings, or it could refer to ancient kings who claim that they descended from the gods. Like Lamech, they acquire as many wives as they wanted, and they produce the Nephilim, these great warriors of old. Whichever view is correct, the point is that humans are building kingdoms that fill God's world with violence and even more corruption. In response, we are told that God is broken with grief. Humanity is ruining his good world, and they are ruining each other. So, out of a passion to protect the goodness of his world, he washes it clean of humanity's evil with a great flood. But he protects one blameless human, Noah and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. So our hopes are very high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. Then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. So here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first. And the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia come together around this new technology they have, a brick, and they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody has ever done before. They want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It is an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It is the garden rebellion now writ large. So God humbles their pride and scatters them. 8. Conclusion and hope. Now this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they are all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. These stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad, that we have all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict, violence, and ultimately death. But there is hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. So, despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. The big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that is what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about. Part 2. God and the story of Abraham and his family. Genesis chapters 12 to 50. 1. Abraham's calling and promise. God created all things and made humans in his image to rule the world on his behalf. Humans chose sin and rebellion, and so the world spun out of control into violence and death, all leading up to the rebellion and scattering of the people in Babylon. Therefore, the biggest question is, what is God going to do to rescue and redeem his world? From that scattering at Babylon, the author traces a genealogy of just one family that leads eventually to a man named Abram, later known as Abraham. God's promise to Abraham at the beginning of chapter 12 opens up a whole new movement. In the story, God calls Abraham to leave his home and go to the land of Canaan, which God says will become his one day. In that land, God promises to make Abraham into a great nation, to make his name great, and to bless him. These promises are connected back to earlier parts of the book. Babylon had arrogantly tried to make a great name for itself, and that did not go over very well. But God, in his generosity, is going to bestow a great name on this no-name guy, Abraham. God's blessing of Abraham echoes all the way back to that original blessing God gave humanity in the beginning. 2. The mission of Abraham's family. The question is, why is God going to bless Abraham and his family? The last line of God's promise makes this clear. So that all the families of the earth will find God's blessing in you. Now this is key for understanding the whole rest of the biblical story. God's plan is to rescue and bless his rebellious world through Abraham's family. This is why the whole rest of the Old Testament story is just going to focus on this one family, eventually called the people of Israel. This is also why Israel will later be called a kingdom of priests at Mount Sinai. God wants to use them to show all of the other nations what he is like. Ultimately, this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets and poets, who say that its fulfillment will come through Israel's messianic king, whose reign will bring justice and peace to all of the nations. At this point of the story, none of that is clear. You just have to keep reading and watch the promise develop. 3. The generations of Abraham's family. So, the rest of this book focuses on Abraham and his family. First Abraham himself, then his son Isaac, and then Isaac's son Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons. The stories about each generation are united by two main themes. First, each generation of Abraham's family is marked by repeated failure. They just keep making very bad decisions that mess up their lives and that put God's promise in jeopardy. However, God remains faithful to them. He keeps rescuing them from themselves and reaffirming his commitment to bless them and bless the nations through them despite their failings. 4. Abraham's story and the covenant. In Abraham's story, God had promised Abraham a huge family, but on 2 different occasions, he is afraid for his life because other men are attracted to his wife, and so he denies that he is even married to her, which creates, of course, all of these problems. Not only that, Abraham and his wife Sarah cannot have children. So Sarah arranges for Abraham to sleep with one of their servant girls, which also creates all of these problems in the family. But each time God helps Abraham out. And in chapter 15 and chapter 17, God even formalizes his promise to Abraham with an official commitment called a covenant. This is a classic scene. God invites Abraham to look up at the night stars and to count them, and he says, "Your descendants will be like them, numerous." Despite all of the odds, having no children, and no way to have any at the moment. Abraham looks up in the sky and simply trusts God's promise, and God responds by entering into a covenant with Abraham, promising that he will become a father of many nations, that God's blessing may come to the whole world. God asks Abraham to mark his family with a sign of the covenant, circumcision of all the male boys in the family. This is a symbol to remind them that the fruitfulness of their family is a gift from God. Abraham eventually has many children, and he dies at a good old age. 5. Jacob's story and wrestling with God. Now Jacob's story plays out these themes even more dramatically. From birth, Jacob lives up to the meaning of his name, which is deceiver. He cheats his brother Esau out of his inheritance and blessing, and he does it by deceiving his old blind father no less. Then he just takes off. He goes on to take 4 wives, even though he really only loves one, Rachel. This creates all of these rivalries in the family. The only thing that humbles Jacob is being deceived by his uncle Laban, who cheats him out of years of his life. The tables have finally turned, and so it is a humbled Jacob that returns to his homeland. In a very strange story, Jacob ends up wrestling with God as he demands that God bless him. Some things never really change, do they? However, God honors his determination, and he passes Abraham's blessing on to him, and he renames Jacob as Israel, which means wrestles with God. 6. Joseph's story and God's faithfulness. Now it is this last part of the book, the story of Jacob's sons, where all the themes come to a head. Jacob loves his second to youngest son, Joseph, more than any of the others, and he gives him this special jacket. The 10 older sons come to hate Joseph, so they kidnap him and they plan to kill him, but instead they decide to just sell him into slavery in Egypt, where he ends up in prison. Talk about family failure. But God is with Joseph, and he orchestrates Joseph's release from prison. Pharaoh ends up elevating Joseph to second in command over all of Egypt. So Joseph saves the nation of Egypt during a famine. He also ends up saving his brothers and his family from starving to death. So, once again, we can see the folly and the sin of Abraham's family is met with God's faithfulness, who subverts even the evil of the brothers into an occasion to save life. This is actually what Joseph says near the end of the book. He says to his brothers, "You all planned this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save many lives." These words are strategically placed at the end of the book because they summarize not only the story of Joseph and his brothers, but the book as a whole. From Genesis chapter 3 onward, humans keep acting selfishly and doing evil. But this God is not going to leave his world to its own devices. He remains faithful and determined to bless people despite their failures. 7. The promise of the Messiah. You can see this especially in how that mysterious promise about the descendant of the woman gets developed throughout the book. So remember Genesis chapter 3. God promised that this wounded victor would come and crush the snake and defeat evil at its source. The author then connects this promise directly to the line of Abraham. This is a part of how God is going to bring his blessing to the nations. Now, from Abraham, this promise gets connected to Judah, the 4th son of Jacob. This is in chapter 49, an extremely important poem. In aging Jacob, he is on his deathbed. He wants to bless his 12 sons. When he comes to Judah, Jacob predicts that Judah will become the tribe of Israel's royal leaders, and that one day a king will come who will command the obedience of all the nations and fulfill God's promise to restore the garden blessing to all of the world. After this, Jacob dies, and later Joseph dies too, and the growing family remains in Egypt. So the book of Genesis ends with all of these future hopes and promises left hanging and undeveloped. And it forces you to turn the page to see how it is all going to turn out. But, for now, that is the book of Genesis. And it forces you to turn the page to see how it is all going to turn out. But, for now, that is the book of Genesis.